On memorials and commemoration in the U.S. Tonight's program will start with a short video about the humanities at URI.
We are facing problems and challenges that do not have easy, simple, finite solutions. Machines are going to be doing so much stuff for us. The only things that are going to be left are the things that only human brains can do. And those kinds of things are taught by the arts and humanities.
Studying the humanities, studying literature, drama, art, performance, what that feeds in a student is possibility.
The University of Rhode Island is a really good place to pursue one's interests in an environment of opportunities. That engagement, in some way, shape, or form, becomes in part the definition of the university experience.
Every area of the humanities trains you to investigate, explore. If you want to lead, you have to have a broad, interdisciplinary, open-minded approach to the world.
Exploration is the foundation of everything that we do. You have to be able to think beyond the circumstances you're presently in. The critical thinking, the language skills, reasoning abilities, those are the ways that you can build a bridge between what you did before and what you can do in the future.
The skills students learn in the humanities are skills that they will take into every aspect of their future life, both personal and professional.
The problems that we have facing us are complicated issues that require people who move across disciplines, think creatively, think deeply. That's something that humanities provides. You're getting that methodology and the practice that'll prepare you for your future.
Good evening. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities. I'd like to welcome you to the first event in our year-long series, Memorials and Commemoration in the U.S. This series of virtual and in-person events will discuss our collective decisions and dialogues about what to commemorate, the ideals we express, and whom we include. Tonight's talk is the first of 3 exciting events we have planned this semester. This evening, the Center is delighted to welcome Professor Kent Blansett, who will be speaking about Think Indigenous, Richard Oakes and the Red Power Movement. We will have questions and answers after the panel, so please type your questions into the chat at any time and be sure to like and share this talk on social media. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Christian Gonzalez, Professor of Native American and Early American History at URI, to introduce our speaker.
Excited to be here. Thank you, Dr. Blansett, for your talk tonight, and thank you to the audience members for tuning in, and thank you, Dr. Stern, for setting this all up for us. I do want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Wongunk tribal lands in the state of Connecticut. And without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Blansett. Kent Blansett is a Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Shawnee, Potawatomi descendant from the Blanket, Panther, and Smith families. He is the Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History at the University of Kansas. Professor Blansett also serves as the founder and executive director for the American Indian Digital History Project. He has published numerous articles and book chapters, including When the Stars Fell from the Sky, the Cherokee Nation and Autonomy During the Civil War, and San Francisco, Red Power and the Emergence of an Indian City. His latest book, A Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz and the Red Power Movement, is the first biography to explore the dynamic life and times of Aquasozny Mohawk student leader Richard Oakes, who was a key figure in the 1969 takeover of Alcatraz Island by the organization Indians of All Tribes. Dr. Blansett.
Okay, I hope everybody can see the PowerPoint. Before I begin, I would like to say thank you to our sponsors, the University of Rhode Island's Center for the Humanities, for inviting me to deliver this talk this evening. Especially thank you also to Doctors Eric Loomis, Evelyn Stern, as well as Christian Gonzalez. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Dr. Blansett, you unshared your screen, just to let you know.
Oh, okay. How do I cancel? Share screen.
This is the exciting part about doing virtual talks. That makes it more interesting, you know.
There we go. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a special thank you, as I was saying, to Drs. Eric Loomis, Evelyn Stern, as well as Christian Gonzalez for that fabulous introduction, as well as Leah Cooper, who's working behind the scenes to make the magic happen this evening for organizing this event. My presentation today, is noted in the introduction, is based upon my latest book, which is entitled A Journey to Freedom, Richard Oakes, Alcatraz, and the Red Power Movement. It was recently just released this last year in paperback, which is the version that you can see on this slide in front of you. I elected to include an important slogan within the title of my talk for this evening. Think Indian, or rather think Indigenous. Think Indian actually originates from the Red Power era. Well before the occupation of Alcatraz, this phrase alone echoed the core teachings from a new generation of Indigenous intellectuals, from Alfonso Ortiz to Henrietta Whiteman to Vine Deloria Jr. to B. Medicine. Now, during the Alcatraz takeover, Richard Oakes had proclaimed that, quote, the educational system in this country is not part of this country if it doesn't get in tune with the thinking of American Indian people. Oakes, as one of the first coordinators of Native American studies, thus championed the cause of Think Indian, or Think Indigenous, which is central to the fight to desegregate higher educational curriculum. Now, as my talk today will demonstrate, and as I often remind my students, you can't know American history without Indigenous history. Now, this evening, we'll try to explore the complex life and times of Richard Oakes, from his earliest years all the way to his assassination in 1972. So what follows is a story that has never been told until today. Richard Oakes was born on May 22nd, 1942. He was born on a reservation called Aquasozny, which is located in the northern part of New York State. Interesting enough, the reservation crosses the boundary line between Canada and the United States. So part of the reservation is on the Canadian side, another part is on the United States side. Richard had an aunt that owned a hotel, and this hotel was actually on the border. So they would joke about having to get your passport to go use the restroom on the other side of the house, just because of the idea of living in two different geopolitical states within the reservation. And because of this, the politics were thus very complex at Aquasozny. On the Canadian side, it was administered under two provinces, which split the reservation between Ontario and Quebec. In addition to that, with provincial law, you also had the Indian Act to contend with, which also organized at least a band council as representative for Aquasozny. On the United States side, it was organized under the Reorganization Act, at least of 1934. So you had another band council on the U.S. side, in addition to dealing with the state of New York. And beyond that is the traditional governance for the Haudenosaunee peoples, which is the traditional longhouse, which is where a majority of the leadership at Aquasozny resides. Now, while Aquasozny is this really fascinating place that we could spend the entire evening talking about, the story for Richard Oakes moves beyond just Aquasozny's borders to a sister reservation, which is located right outside of Montreal, called Ganawage Reserve. Now, Ganawage Reserve is a sister community to Aquasozny, and where this story really takes off is this bridge, which you can see in the slide in front of you, is the Mercier Bridge. What Montreal was wanting to do in the early 1850s is they were wanting to build a bridge through Ganawage. And this railroad bridge, what it would do is it would bring in a lot of supplies, or at least imports and exports, to and from the United States to bolster the economy of Montreal, make it really kind of a trade center in Canada. But to build this bridge, they were going to have to go through Ganawage land. They were going to need Ganawage permission to do so. The elders there essentially said, if you want to build your bridge on our land, you then have to hire all Mohawk workers. So this was timber frame construction in the 1850s. They hired all Mohawk workers to build this bridge, because before this, most of the supplies had to be taken down the St. Lawrence River, which would have the Lachine Rapids, as you can see here. They were very fierce, so it took a long time to be able to get supplies to and from it, in and out of Montreal, crossing the St. Lawrence River. So this bridge was going to be absolutely instrumental. Ganawage Mohawks took a commanding presence within the labor force of bridge construction. Eventually, timber frame would be replaced with ironwork, and the Mohawks would continue to maintain a commanding presence within the ironworking industry. And of course, by the late 19th century, America would be caught in the throes of the great industrial revolution. Cities would be being built, and skyscrapers would be reaching the skies in places like Boston and New York, and they would require more and more iron workers to become a part of this force. So Ganawage would reach out to its sister community of Aquasozny, and they begin training iron workers to work in places like Boston and New York and other places like Providence, even in the building of these great modern metropolises. In fact, in New York City, it is estimated that approximately 15% of the ironworking labor force within New York were Haudenosaunee or Mohawk workers primarily. And you can see this in 1952, this National Geographic slide would write about Mohawk ironworkers in this piece entitled "The Mohawks Scrape the Sky." And people were fascinated with this idea of Mohawks not only living in New York City, but building this modern metropolis, one of the greatest cities of the world. And of course, they were more enthralled in National Geographic with attributing superhuman abilities to Mohawk ironworkers. Like they would say, well, they're Indian, right? So they're superhuman. They can defy gravity and they can walk on these steel beams without any fear. And every ironworker I interviewed said that was absolute malarkey. It was not true at all. In fact, it was very scary because there was no safety standards for a lot of these ironworkers, and many would fall to their deaths. It was a completely dangerous profession at this time. You were working 40, 60 stories up, oftentimes without safety harnesses, without safety nets to be able to catch you. And so if you fell to your death. And because of that, it meant that this was a market that Mohawks could exploit. There was no racism in this industry because they couldn't recruit people to go up 60 stories and risk their life every day. And it also meant not only was there very little racism and that Mohawks could take a very commanding presence in this labor industry, but there was also high pay because the work was so dangerous. So they began moving their families and building an alternative Mohawk city within Brooklyn based upon this one trade. Now, Richard's dad, as well as his uncles, would become a part of this ironworking tradition. Up here in the right-hand corner of the PowerPoint, you can see a color photo of ironworkers standing on top of what is the North Tower of the World Trade Center. And the far right over here is actually Richard's father, Arthur Oakes, who was a foreman within the ironworking industry. In fact, Richard's dad was on the North Tower building it. And of course, Richard's brother, Leonard Oakes, was on the South Tower building the World Trade Center. So there was this strong force in which Arthur Oakes was instrumental in getting his son Richard involved in this ironworking industry and trade. He would Richard drop out of school at the age of 16 to become an iron worker within the industry. And at that point, the industry was kind of rudimentary in the sense of how it built these skyscrapers. And Richard was a part of an ironworking gang, as this picture to the left demonstrates. When I interviewed Dean Chavers, who was one of the mainland coordinators of the Alcatraz Occupation, he mentioned seeing Richard one day take his shirt off. And he was covered with all these scars all over his chest. And he asked Richard, he's like, how did you get these scars? And Richard just smiled. He was like, I was a Mohawk ironworker in New York. I built all those skyscrapers. And he said, I was a catcher on a riveting gang. And what it meant is you can see here, they had this barrel of hot coals that heats these rivets up, which you can see the guy lighting a cigarette with one of those hot mushroom-shaped rivets. They heat them up till they're red hot, and they throw them down. And there's another individual that then has a cone-shaped can who tries to catch those hot rivets in midair. And then they take those rivets and they set them one at a time within the joints of those iron beams. And they use a pneumatic hammer to then taper the other end of that. And it literally, when it cools, it takes all the air out of that steel beam. So all that great city was built one steel beam, one rivet at a time by Mohawk ingenuity a lot of the times. And of course, when you go to Ganawage, even to this day, like you can see from the political statement or graffiti here, they're incredibly proud of their contributions to Mohawk ironworking. And they built a major city. Richard would not just grow up in Aquasozny, he would grow up in Brooklyn, New York, right around the Red Hook or Gowanus district. And of course, a big part of the story was finding out how Mohawks were not only being shaped by this neighborhood, but how they were shaping the neighborhood itself, how they were indigenizing Brooklyn and making it their own. This is a really rare photo of Richard when he was younger. It took me a long time to be able to find this. The Sullivan family shared this with me for the book. This is a young Richard Oakes here. You can kind of see the charisma shining through. And then this is his brother, Leonard Oakes, who I had the chance to be able to interview. And this is his mom, and his mom was named Irene Foote, and she was perhaps one of the most pivotal persons in Richard Oakes' young life in the sense of influencing. She grew up on the Canadian side of the reserve at Aquasozny, and then, of course, his dad, Arthur Oakes, grew up on the U.S. side. She was a product of the residential boarding school system, which Leonard would mention was really difficult, because being a part of that boarding school system when you're shipped off at a very young age, you were not taught necessarily how to be familiar. You would lose that ability to be able to exchange and share love in some of the proper ways. You would say that she was very militaristic in the sense of running the household. She would time you on the phone to make sure that you would get off the phone in time, in other words. But she was also someone who worked really hard for her boys. Her and Arthur Oakes would divorce when Richard was very young and Leonard was very young. She would have to put the kids in an orphanage for a while, and she would work 2 jobs in order to be able to afford the house that you see next to this photo, which is there in Brooklyn, in the kind of south slope district of Brooklyn in Gowanus area. And the kids, of course, room was on the 2nd story here. And Richard, I think, because of the divorce, really had wanted to get to know his dad even more, which was kind of the driving force of him wanting to enter ironwork. Plus, he was involved in this Mohawk city where ironworking was alive in the sense of Gowanus, Brooklyn. And one of the people that would catch up on this kind of indigenizing of the city was a Dr. David M. Corey. Now, Dr. Corey is fascinating part of the story, because he was this guy who had a Presbyterian church in the middle of Brooklyn. Now, if you know a little bit about Aquasozny Mohawks as well as Ganawage Mohawks, they're predominantly Catholic. And so he's walking the streets. He's realizing he doesn't have anybody in his pews for Sunday service, and he's trying to figure out, how do I recruit church members? And as he's walking the streets of Brooklyn, he hears this language that he's never heard before being spoken, which is Mohawk. And he says, what is this language? And he begins to learn and teach himself not only the Mohawk language, but they also create and write a Mohawk hymnal. At least through this, he begins leading sermons in the Mohawk language. And pretty soon, despite Mohawks being Catholic, they start going to Dr. David Corey's church because they could hear their language being sang, they could hear their language being spoken, and their kids could also hear it, even outside of the public school system where they weren't learning the language necessarily. David Corey would also go on to write one of the first urban Indian history books that would be published in the 1940s and or 50s. Now, one of the other major institutions besides the Indian church within at least Brooklyn were Indian bars. Now, one of the more famous of these bars was the Wigwam. The Wigwam bar was famous because when you walked into that bar, there would be a giant sign above the door that said, home to the world's greatest ironworkers. And this was a Mohawk-run bar. So it was run by Ganawage Mohawks. And of course, it was a place of not only socialization and dating, it was a place that you could drop and give an address when you're looking to get work in ironwork. They would have an address at least the wigwam that they would be able to use. If you're looking to find boarding or housing, it was the first place that a lot of people stopped, at least when they entered into Brooklyn to get into this profession. But the wigwam was something more than that. There was a lot of cultural pride there. They would have posters of Sitting Bull and Jim Thorpe up, alongside, photographs of John F. Kennedy. There would at least be Native leaders as well. Behind the bar, there would be the hard hats or gustoe, or headdresses for at least those who had fallen. And at times when ironworkers were lost, they would create a community fund to fund the families of those who had lost that beloved loved one. If you go to Brooklyn today, the Ironworker Bar is Hank's Saloon. So if you're walking around Brooklyn, look for Hank's Saloon, and you might run into a few Mohawk ironworkers that are still working within the city. Now, Richard Oakes would be working a job in Rhode Island. Interesting enough, he was working there building a bridge, and he decided that he would leave ironworking all behind. He took all of his money and he would buy a new 1965 red convertible Mustang. His brother always makes me say that because Richard literally loved that car. And he would decide to move to San Francisco, which this was a time in 1968. It was about the summer of love. San Francisco was a happening place, and it also meant a significant life change for him. But along the way, when he was driving across country, he had this kind of Gandhi-esque trip in which he was stopping off at different reservations and places along the way, and he was asking people about, like, how did relocation affect you? How did Termination Act affect your community? What's your history? What are you about? Where are your people from? He was literally creating his own Indian studies course as he tracks across the country and lands in San Francisco. Now, the famous story with Richard, too, was one in which there was a bit of irony here. His first job in San Francisco was driving a delivery truck. And the reason why I give you a sense of irony here is he had an arrest record. When he was in his youth, he got involved with gangs. And of course, at Onondaga, they decided they would go up to Syracuse, and they found this meat truck that was left idle. And they steal this meat truck and they drive it back down to the Onondaga reservation. And they start handing meat out to the people, like, who wants a T-bone, who wants a filet mignon, right? And so they're handing this meat out to the people. And of course, the cops show up. His buddies had fled. They'd cut the scene really quickly. Richard's caught red-handed in the back of the truck. So there was this kind of early leadership potential even for Richard Oakes, in this idea of taking risk and not being afraid to take risk when necessary for the people. He did serve a little bit of time in jail for doing that, but he would also then come into San Francisco, not only work as a delivery truck driver, but he would also become a bartender at Warren's Slaughterhouse Bar. Now, a little backstory about San Francisco as an Indian city. I mean, it had always been an Indian city. San Francisco was founded upon the lands of the Ohlone peoples, or the Ohlone Nation, within San Francisco, as well as the coastal Miwok people. And of course, it had also hosted a number of Native peoples from outing programs from California local boarding schools that would send Native students there to be able to work in San Francisco in the community. So they'd always had an Indigenous presence within San Francisco. But this Indigenous presence was heightened really by the 1970s, in which the population grew to about 30,000. Some of the institutions, like we talked about with the Mohawk City, were also present within San Francisco's Indian City, like Indian bars themselves. There was over 450 Indian-owned businesses. Native studies, which we'll get to in a second, became another cornerstone piece of this Indian city. Powwow cultures, which would happen just about every weekend, that would allow people to be able to sell trades and wares, along with being able to just keep one's culture in this kind of intertribal atmosphere, was really critical. There was also Indian churches, from the Native American Church to the Indian Baptist Church, along with a number of Indian organizations and media presentations, like the Indian Historian, one of the first academic journals, would be published out of San Francisco in 1964, and would continue on into the 1980s as one of the most kind of famous academic publications for all of Indian country. Now, working at Warren's Slaughterhouse Bar is an interesting place because Dean Chambers, I asked him about it. He said, it was one of the grungiest, most dirtiest bars that you'd ever seen. In other words, they had to have a garage door on the front of it added because too many people have been thrown out through the plate glass windows from bar fights. So they put a garage door on it just to keep the fighting to a minimum so they didn't have to replace the windows all the time. It was a rough and tough bar. But it was also the one bar that later American Indian movement leader Russell Means, who was a Oglala Lakota, would say it was the first place he also heard about the Termination Act at that time. So there was also politics being discussed within these bars. There was organizing that was being done. And being a part of a bartender at this bar meant that you knew people. You were networked into the community. The bar itself was just 2 storefronts down from the American Indian Center. And a lot of the Indian centers would start in the 1950s, and the Indian centers came about also as a answer to failed government policies. And one of those failed government policies was the relocation program, which would start in 1948 as an experiment with Navajo and Hopi peoples to relocate Indigenous peoples to the city so that we would become a part of this melting pot and we would forget our tribal identity. We'd become detribalized by the modernity of the city. And we would cease to become Cherokee. We'd cease to become Lakota or Dene, and we would assume kind of a quasi-American Indian identity, just as others would be German Americans and Irish Americans. We would just be another kind of ethnicity at that point. And that detribalization would be another way to increase or accelerate land grabs. And of course, out of this relocation program, they would promise Native peoples that would relocate to one of 6 cities, San Francisco being one of them, jobs. They would promise them housing. They would promise them groceries, furniture, and of course, job training if they needed it. And of course, usually about 1 month after people arrived in the cities, what they found is these to be broken promises. And they would wind up in kind of the ghetto of these cities, or what would be called the Red Ghetto. And in San Francisco, this was called the Mission District, was where a majority of Native peoples wound up. The Indian Center was on 16th Street in Valencia in the Mission District. And of course, on the second story of the Mission, or of the Indian Center, Richard would meet his future wife, which was Annie Oakes. They'd meet at a Vietnam anti-Vietnam rally or protest in San Francisco. She had several kids from a previous marriage prior to that, which Richard automatically made his own children. And the kids would receive tutoring in that second story. And the tutors have a really central role to play in this larger story of the occupation. The tutors came from San Francisco State College. And the tutors got to know not only Annie Oakes and the kids, but they also got to know Richard, who would come to pick up the kids. Ever so often, they knew Richard to be networked in the community and also extremely charismatic. And this is important because at San Francisco State, they got caught up in some of the largest college campus riots in our nation's history. In fact, my students love this when I tell the story because what happened essentially was that students began to look around in their classrooms and they realized, you know what? We don't have any classes on Black history. We don't have any classes on Asian history or Latinx history or Chicana history. We have no classes on Native history. And you know what? That doesn't reflect what my world and what my street looks like when I leave this campus. In other words, they were kind of seeing that they were being conditioned in a way, that their education had not been desegregated at all in the 1950s. And so what they began to say is, we want ethnic studies to be able to be formed. So to do so, they began to walk out of campus and they would lead a strike. Faculty would also agree with the students throughout San Francisco State, and the faculty would refuse to teach their classes and would walk out as well. Out of this, it echoed a police response, which at times became incredibly violent, in which students were being at least arrested by the hundreds on a daily basis. And of course, you have then the Berkeley Barb here on the right, which was the independent newspaper showcasing the president at the time of San Francisco State, which was S.I. Hayakawa, who would become later a senator for California. And of course, this individual, which a lot of people know, who's navigating the plane, was the governor at the time, who would be later a U.S. president, Ronald Reagan. You can see this kind of remember Hayakawa. He's flying a Japanese Zero plane. He was Japanese American. So they were really centering into this idea of a war that was happening in the streets and a changing of the guard, so to speak, and also pinpointing the conditioning that they were reacting to and trying to create what would be the first ever ethnic studies program. Now, of course, one of the other exciting things that would happen in this is that Richard Oakes would be appointed the first ever coordinator of Native American Studies at San Francisco State. Within this first class, if you will, of Native American Studies, he would bring in what was the White Roots of Peace Caravan. The White Roots of Peace Caravan was sponsored by Jerry Gamble here. It was a group of Haudenosaunee leaders that were going around and teaching about the great law of peace, but more importantly, about Haudenosaunee ethics as well as culture and belief systems. And out of this, they really transformed and changed Richard. You can see Richard here embracing a lot of his Haudenosaunee heritage. Here he is wearing a gustoe, which is that traditional headdress. His boys are here carrying a lacrosse stick, which 90% of the lacrosse sticks in the world were manufactured at Aquasozny. And then, of course, this is young Tom Porter, who is a Longhouse leader even to this day, and Peter Mitten and other leaders. And Jerry Gamble here, that's right next to Richard, wrote Aquasozny Notes, which was the world's leading native newspaper at the time. And of course, the first issue of that would be written on Richard's typewriter. So the roots, the structure of Red Power is influenced by an East Coast or Haudenosaunee movement, essentially, is what this picture really speaks to, which is why this is so important. But it also will throw Richard more into an idea of wanting to do more for his people in general. Now, Richard would also make a really key decision at Native American Studies. He would hire this woman who's pictured here, Belva Cautier. And Belva Cautier was really important because she was involved in an earlier occupation of Alcatraz in 1964. This earlier occupation was sponsored by those who were Lakota, who were living in San Francisco. You can see here a young Russell Means in his powwow regalia. And of course, others like Richard McKenzie, his father Hank Means, would also be involved in this early kind of takeover. Alcatraz was decommissioned as a federal prison in 1963. 1964 was declared literally surplus property. So Belva Cautier would do the legal research for this early occupation, and she would use treaties. More importantly, she would use the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. And in that treaty, she found a clause in which abandoned federal property was to revert back over to the Lakota people, or surplus property, if you will. And she decided, well, since Alcatraz was federal property, it was declared surplus, and because we have treaty, which is a legally binding document in regards to a nation-to-nation document, that this should revert to Lakota hands. So they led this takeover. It lasted all of about an hour before people were then taken back off and escorted off the island, but it caught major press attention. And that's the important piece of this story. Richard Oakes hires Belva Cautier as his community liaison. She tells the students these stories. And the students at San Francisco State were also organized really well because they were meeting at night with other Native students who were organized at Berkeley under the leadership of Lenata Means, who is Shoshone Bannock. This is a picture of Lenata here. The students would organize these kind of teach-ins that were orchestrated by Jack Forbes, who is Lenape and Renape descent. And Jack Forbes would kind of lead these teach-ins to talk about sovereignty, talk about direct action. He would bring in leaders from the National Indian Youth Council, like Melvin Thom, Clyde Warrior, and others to kind of talk to students about direct action politics and how to basically lead a movement, much like the echoing of the civil rights movement, to usher in change and bring press attention to Native issues. So the students get this idea that together what they're going to do is they're going to make a statement. They're going to try to repeal relocation as a program. They're also going to try to repeal another destructive piece of legislation called termination, which in 1953, the termination era, as it's known, came about, in which the federal government would create different acts. Like there would be a Klamath Act, there would be a Ponca Act. And out of this, what they were doing is terminating the federal trust responsibility with tribes. And they would do this with 109 nations. So you would no longer be recognized as a federally recognized tribe when this would happen. And then, of course, what this would do is leave open those former reservation lands for further exploitation. It was a very destructive policy that would run its course all the way up into the 1970s. And of course, Lynetta, Richard, they all wanted to do a major statement that would capture major press, just like the 64 occupation, to draw attention to these larger issues that we were dealing with as Indigenous peoples at the time. So where this occupation comes down is November of 1969. November 9th, precisely, they lead a protest movement in which they write a proclamation. They organize themselves as a kind of an organizing body. They call themselves the Indians of All Tribes, or IAT. And they go down to the docks of San Francisco. They have the press all there. They're organized, and they read a proclamation. And Alcatraz was great press because it was like good street theater. Alcatraz represented a failed federal prison. It was crumbling, just like the crumbling of Indian policy by the federal government. It represented also a reservation space that they could mimic, right? It lacked any electricity. It lacked running water. It lacked plumbing. It had no infrastructure. In other words, there was no healthcare. There was no industry. There was no jobs. There was rampant unemployment. The buildings were crumbling beneath the people. So it represented at least not only failed federal Indian policy, but it was a way to be able to teach the greater America about the lack of Indigenous rights for Native peoples. And Richard Oakes would automatically become the main speaker for the movement in and of itself, or spokesperson for Indians of All Tribes. He was also part of the council. But in that first moment, they're reading to the reporters the proclamation. They're wanting to get across the island. The problem was they didn't have a boat. So November 9th, they go around and they find this guy, Ronald Craig, who had this triple-masted, looked like a pirate ship, but it was like the Canadian Endeavor. It was like a boat that was built to mimic the explorer James Cook's famous ship. And they asked the guy, they're like, hey, can we take your ship? Could you take us over to the island? And he was like looking at all the reporters following the students. And he said, yeah, this is great press attention for the boat. Although I cannot land on Alcatraz because the boat would be seized. I would lose my job. They might see it as a state of war, considering we're flying the Canadian flag. So he decided, I'll sail you around the island, and that's as good as it'll get. They get on the boat, all the students, and of course, Ronald Craig is like dressed like kind of Austin Powers in this crushed velvet leisure suit with, even a sword because he's a reenactor. And then he has these cannons and he fires the cannons off. The reporters go wild, the students go wild. And it wasn't going to be good enough for Richard. By the time they get up close to the island, Richard goes to the front of the boat. He takes his shirt off and wearing his cherished pair of cowboy boots and his jeans, he jumps headfirst in to the San Francisco Bay and he swims over 250 yards to the island, claiming it. Where the boat wouldn't take it, he would self-determine himself to be able to make it to the island and showcase the momentum of this movement. Now, of course, he was taken off very quickly thereafter. But he knew they could come back. He knew they could do this. He would travel up and down the state of California, speaking at UCLA, speaking at Sonoma State, other California campuses to larger bodies of Native students. And of course, getting a further commitment of those Native students for a D-Day occupation, which was November 20th of 1969. On that day, they would gather in Sausalito, which was on the other side of the bay. And of course, they would do a night landing around 2 or 3 in the morning. They would land on Alcatraz Island, and this would capture international press attention. This is one of the only posed photographs from the island. It was taken by Art Kane, who is a famous celebrity rock and roll photographer for Look magazine. This was reprinted in Look magazine in June 2nd of 1970, but an incredibly rare photograph. You can see Richard Oakes here in the front. Next to him is his wife here, Annie Oakes. Next to Annie Oakes, the very far would be your left. As you're looking at it is John Trudell with his daughter. And then, of course, Stella Leach, Ray Sprang, and then, of course, Ross Hardin in that front row, all original occupiers. And of course, this would make Richard Oakes a media sensation overnight. Here he is reading the proclamation to T.E. Hannon, who was in charge of the General Services Administration, who oversaw the island for the federal government. And they wanted to transform this Alcatraz, this federal prison, into a new cultural center. They wanted to create a university, an ecological center, a spiritual center for Native peoples, and make it one of the first places that you would see on the West Coast would be Indian land. that it would become like the Statue of Liberty on the West Coast, but essentially, speaking to the liberty, the freedom of Native peoples, and what that freedom entails, and what that freedom meant in the sense of the sacrifice of our freedom for the start of this country as well. And of course, we could see this in the press attention that would follow. Good Housekeeping, even the Cult of Domesticity, would cover the Alcatraz occupation. Here's Richard Oakes and Annie Oakes walking in with Adrian Quinn, a famous actor at the time that was also coming to the island. Creedence Clearwater Revival, famous band, would donate money for a boat, the Clearwater, to be able to get occupiers back and forth. Jane Fonda would donate generators to the island. Candace Bergen would also come to the island. Jonathan Winters, a famous comedian, would be on the island as well. So not only did they get international press attention, but they were gathering attention from kind of the movers and shakers, the influencers, if you will, of that day and era. And it wasn't just that they were gathering the attention of those media moguls. They were also gathering the attention of a coalition politic that a lot of people fail to kind of recognize as the centering of 60s political action, and that's coalition politics. Now, this picture up here is of really great importance. This is the Indians of All Tribes banner that was being marched down a moratorium march in 1970 in East LA, which was a moratorium march sponsored by the Brown Berets to end the Vietnam War, which would erupt in violence in the end. But you can see this idea that it was about coalitioning. It was about reaching up to other organizations for strategy, for help, but also for essentially organizing power, if you will. This movement of Alcatraz would later influence even the Brown Berets. Later in the early 1970s, the Brown Berets would take over Catalina Island outside of Los Angeles, which was an attempt also to return this land to Aztlan. The Black Panther Party, this is one of their newsletters. You can see here, this is Big Bear, or Poundmaker, who is a part of the Louis Riel rebellion on the Canadian side, and then of course Geronimo, who led a rebellion between the borders of Mexico and the United States for Apache resistance to U.S. colonialism. And then of course Earth Times. Many people fail to understand that Earth Day comes out of San Francisco in the early part of the 1970s as well. The Black Panthers here are talking to Richard Oakes and John Trudell. They worked security for the Alcatraz occupation. So part of this was that there was coalition building throughout San Francisco. These movements were in communication. They weren't just happening in separate spheres. They were influencing one another with their politic. And not only that, the students were highly organized on the island. They created supply lines and supply runs. They created solidarity rallies with leading musicians at the time like Buffy St. Marie giving up all their proceeds or ticket sales back to fund this occupation. They began turning the water on, using all their skills like Richard's ironworking skills to begin having running water once again on the island. They built a health clinic. They started a newsletter. And of course, the family in the midst of this, Richard Oakes' family, would catch major media attention along the way. This is a really rare photograph. This is Annie Oakes, his wife on the island, who is Kashaya Pomo from Northern California. And this is their two kids. So this is Tanya here. This is thought to be Leonard. And this is also thought to be Yvonne that's holding Leonard in this picture. And Yvonne was the only child to come on the island on that first day of the occupation. They would later bring the rest of their family onto the occupation. And part of this was that they wanted to showcase that this was a familiar movement. They were showcasing the modern Indian family as well, and that there was men, women, and children on this island. And this is what would cause Richard Nixon pause to send in troops to automatically evict people right away. He knew that there was families that were on this island, and it would be horrendous press, especially when he was looking to get reelected in 1972. But tragedy would befall the Oakes family in January of 1970. Yvonne would fall. She would fall in the Ira Hayes building from the third story, and of course would later succumb to those injuries in a local hospital. And this would devastate Richard and Annie Oakes. This is a picture of Yvonne here. A lot of these photos have never been seen before. I can talk about that later. It's how I found these photos. But this is Annie walking with a famous portrait of Geronimo up the boating zone. And these were taken November 20th, 1969. But this would change the occupation forever for Richard, because one of the most famous quotes that he had was, Alcatraz is not an island, it's an idea. And the idea here was that what was being done on Alcatraz could then be transported to other reservation communities and urban environments in Indian cities across the country. And so they had to put it in practice. In other words, they created the playbook of Alcatraz, but they were going to put it into practicum in application throughout Northern California as well as into San Francisco. So Richard begins to take the Indians of all tribes on the road, and the organization expands beyond Alcatraz into doing occupations all throughout Northern California. Like I mentioned before, the students were highly organized. This is a really great photo to show. This is Gracethorpe, who is the daughter of the most famous athlete of the first part of the 20th century, Jim Thorpe. And then, of course, she's seated next to John Trudell, who would later become a big leader in the American Indian movement. And these radio shows were nationally syndicated radio shows. They'd be rebroadcast in New York and other places. And John would do interviews with occupiers in which they would tell their personal stories, at least of not only their native histories, but their families, their life, and of course, being able to talk more specifically about the lack of Indigenous rights within the country in and of itself. This was the newsletter, just to give you an idea of how they were publishing this. This was sent to all across the nation. Major universities would receive these as well. Native student organizations, major Native organizations as well, receiving these copies. And they began to transform the island too. They used political statements, is what the veterans prefer that they're called, and not graffiti. And part of this was that they began to transform the island, and part of this was that you couldn't come on the island without being indigenized. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of these political statements towards the end. Richard never stopped organizing once he left the island. His first occupation was he took over the BIA headquarters there in Sacramento, or at least an area office in Sacramento. It lasted all of about one day, but it would precede other BIA occupations that would occur even thereafter. And part of this was that they were beginning to challenge how the government was manufacturing Indian policy without Native peoples being in control of that policy. They were questioning the paternalism of the federal government and its handling of Indigenous affairs. So he would take his activism up to Seattle. Seattle was at least this place that needed an Indian center. There wasn't an Indian center that existed in Seattle at the time. They recruited Richard Oakes to come up and help them with a new occupation. There was land that was kind of on this northern point here of Magnolia, which was Fort Lawton. And Fort Lawton was a military base that was soon declared surplus property. And like Alcatraz, Native peoples wanted to claim that and create a new Indian center within Seattle itself. They would organize themselves and coin the phrase United Indians of all Tribes, which was in honor of the same organization that would found at least the Alcatraz Occupation. They would begin leading a series of strikes outside of the military base. Eventually, they would overrun the military police and they would get arrested. And it would take 3 arrests before they would finally gain control over Fort Lawton. And Fort Lawton would be turned over to United Indians of all Tribes. And today it is the Daybreak Star Indian Center in Seattle. So they were successful. And all the while, Alcatraz is still continuing to go on. Alcatraz would go on for another 19 months in the sense of an occupation. So out of this, we would then have major media attention, of course, being brought into Fort Lawton. This previous image is that of Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda is interesting because she actually goes to participate in Fort Lawton, but she goes to Fort Lewis instead of Fort Lawton. So she has to do a press conference, literally apologizing for going to the wrong fort, but at the same point in time, leading her celebrity to the cause of Indigenous rights at the time. You can see here MPs carrying off people that were evading and entering through the front gate. I love this photo because this is Gary Bray and he's wearing his Alcatraz security jacket. It's to showcase the Indians of all Tribes involvement at Fort Lawton. Now, following on the heels of the success of the Fort Lawton occupations, and of course its handing over later then to United Indians of all Tribes, Richard was really working with one individual in particular, which was Mickey Gimmel. Now, Mickey Gimmel was another student at San Francisco State in that first ever class of students of Native American Studies, or Ethnic Studies as it would come about. And of course, he also became the youngest tribal chairman of Pitt River within Northern California, or the Pitt River Nation, at the age of just 25 years old. And what Mickey was wanting to do is bring Richard and other members of Indians of all tribes in to begin staging occupations in Northern California. And Pitt River Nation in and of itself, like the Lakota Nation, had never given up its land claims. And they had over 3.5 million acres of land, which was territorial lands that they never ceded to the federal government in Northern California. And in the midst of this time period, of course, they would create the Indian Claims Commission in the 1940s, and the Indian Claims Commission would offer to buy the lands like it would the Lakota. And they would offer the Pitt River Nation 47 cents an acre, which was an insult. They refused to ever take compensation or a buyout of their lands. So they remained the sovereign entity over these lands. But the problem was that multinational corporations like Pacific Gas and Electric, Kimberly-Clark Corporation, William Hearst Corporation had all moved on to Pitt River Nation lands and were taking resources without ever compensating the tribe for those resources. And of course, what they wanted to do is begin leading occupations on corporate lands to get those lands returned back and also to challenge it in the court system. So one of the first occupations that they would do would be to take over campgrounds run by PG&E Corporation. And when they took over these campgrounds, of course, they were charged with one interesting provision, which was trespass. And when the cops showed up to arrest everybody was laughing. The cops couldn't figure it out. Like, why are all these guys laughing, right? We're arresting them on trespass. And of course, they said, you just won our case. We wanted to be arrested on trespass because they knew in a court of law, when you're arrested for trespass, you have to prove that you have the original title to that land. And they knew that PG&E Corporation did not. Pitt River Nation did. And this is exactly what it would lead to, is these courtroom battles in which the head of PG&E Corporation got really scared. Their stockholders got really scared. They're one of the larger corporations within Northern California. They were recently in the news because of the fires that were occurring that were led by one of the sparks from their station. But they lead all the gas and electric for Northern California, and more specifically San Francisco. Well, Richard would go into San Francisco and he would try to serve a citizen's arrest on the head of PG&E Corporation. He was eventually would go to Warren's Bar later that day after kind of a media success on bringing media into the headquarters as they tried to serve the citizen's arrest. He was then attacked from behind and beaten to the point where the surgeons literally gave him up for dead. He was lying in a coma. Peter Mitten, who was a Cayuga medicine person here, along with Mad Bear Anderson, who was a part of the Haudenosaunee or the Tuscarora and a Longhouse leader. Peter Mitten would later doctor Richard Oakes. The doctor is saying, we've done everything we can for him. Now we just have to see if he wakes up. And the family asked, can we work with him with our medicines? Peter Mitten would go in, he would take out a tincture, mix a little something into the tincture. He would pour it into Richard's IV. Within an hour, he would get a red kind of spot or circle on his chest. Eventually, his whole body would go flush. Another hour later, his eyes would open and he would finally start talking. The first thing that Richard would do when he would get out of the hospital, which was a miracle in general, is he would go to an anti-war Vietnam or anti-Vietnam rally in Golden Gate, and even in a wheelchair, be able to deliver kind of in slurred speech, a speech rallying at least the people that if I can, kind of survive this attack, we could also survive and we could also have a greater future. And he would get a standing ovation, at least at Golden Gate, for this speech. But he would continue on, at least in the courtroom. And this is a really famed picture of the trial of trespass. And going back to the courtroom, this is Shermer Sibley, who is the president of PG&E Corporation, removing himself as Richard Oakes comes over with a protest banner and or sign, at least trying to get himself out of this photograph before it was captured and reprinted. And of course, more occupations would continue throughout Pitt River. He would lead occupations then into Kashaya, which was his wife's reservation, and they would relocate the kids to Kashaya Pomo lands. This is where the story takes a really dark turn. Outside of Kashaya Pomo lands, there was a YMCA day camp, and Richard Oakes was really interested in this YMCA day camp being a part of original Kashaya lands. He wanted it returned back to Kashaya Pomo Trust. So he was doing research, and he was meeting with California Indian Legal Services in order to be able to talk about a legal kind of lawsuit to make sure that this actually happens. Well, one of the directors of that YMCA camp, Michael Oliver Morgan, who's pictured here, had 2 prior attempts on trying to take Richard Oakes' life in altercations, which we can get into in a little bit. The third attempt, he was successful. Richard Oakes was walking down Skag Springs Road outside the reservation, coming towards at least the YMCA day camp. Michael Morgan got word of this. He would take a loaded Welder P38 9mm gun, what is a German Luger. He would load that gun. He would stick it down his pants. He would start walking towards Skag Springs Road, knowing that Richard was on his way down. And then shortly thereafter, he would pull the gun. He would fire one shot. The shot would penetrate Richard Oakes' heart, killing him instantly on the spot. Morgan would claim self-defense. He was arrested initially for first-degree murder. Within 1 hour, those charges would be dropped to voluntary manslaughter when he would plead self-defense. So that Richard Oakes jumped out from behind a redwood tree and attacked him. Even though Richard Oakes was completely unarmed, even though Morgan could probably outrun Richard because Richard had to teach himself how to walk and or run again as well, because he suffered from paralysis on one half of his body from that earlier brain injury that he sustained in that bar fight. So Morgan pleads self-defense. His charges are dropped to voluntary manslaughter. This is September of 1972. And in a Northern California court of law, Michael Morgan is found not guilty. This would send shockwaves throughout the activist networks all throughout the West Coast, even throughout the rest of America. And Hank Adams, who was organizing fish-ins and survival of American Indians in Pacific Northwest, called for a march on Washington. They would shortly meet in Denver, Colorado. This would be called the Trail of Broken Treaties Caravan. It was organized in memory of Richard Oakes and to draw attention to the plight and this kind of dual system of justice for Native peoples that we experience in this country. And so out of this, the caravan would start out in California. And of course, it would converge and meet in Washington, D.C. And they would later take over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in 1972, be the first time a federal building in Washington, D.C. had been taken over by a foreign power since the War of 1812. And literally, Nixon gets incredibly paranoid and scared about this occupation because 72 is his election year. And he was proclaiming himself to be the native president, which we can talk about at some length here. So he literally buys off the activists. He gives them about $66,000 in a duffel bag. And of course, promises that nobody will be tried or convicted or punished for the takeover. They just need to leave. And they vacate the building. But in the meantime, what Alcatraz had done, Alcatraz would influence Richard Nixon in 1970 to reverse termination. So he ends the Termination Act. He ends the Relocation Act. He would begin restoring native lands, like they restored Taos Blue Lake to Taos Pueblo during this time period. It would usher in a new era called Red Power and Red Power politics. And one of the central leading figures of this movement was Richard Oakes. Now, I have to pause for a bit because one of the questions I always ask, at least my students, the first day of every class, I always ask them, how many people in here have heard of Richard Oakes? I'm doing an introduction. And literally, I never have anybody raise their hand. Nobody's ever heard of this most dynamic figure in all of Indian country. And I have a problem with that. I mean, what if we as a society never heard the names Malcolm X? What if we never heard the names Cesar Chavez? What if we never heard the names Dolores Huerta? What if we never heard the name Martin Luther King Jr.? Where would we be as a society? So the question then is, where and why have we not heard this name, Richard Oakes? So hopefully my goal in writing this book was to bring awareness not only to Richard Oakes, but bring greater awareness to one of those great historical feats of the 20th century, which was the takeover of Alcatraz that would last a period of 19 months. And of course, was a success story. To this day, over 10,000 people a day go to the island and visit it. 5 million people a year visit that island. And the first thing they see when they come up to the island is a sign that says, Indians welcome, which is an amazing sign that we can talk a little bit more about, but they are able to be educated about Indigenous rights and the takeover of Alcatraz, which is still going on. In other words, we may have not got the island officially for a cultural center, but we're still, at least the vision of those students, the vision of Richard Oakes carries on forward even to this day. You can see here, San Francisco State would create the Richard Oakes Multicultural Center at San Francisco State University. Google eventually would create a Google Doodle in honoring of Richard Oakes for his birthday in May. And of course, some of my future projects involve kind of rethinking of the Red Power movement and Native nationalism, but using pop culture as a means to be able to kind of understand that moving forward. So thank you very much for allowing me to share this very pivotal story with you tonight. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Blansett. That was a very interesting talk. I do want to remind everyone to go ahead and ask questions in the comment section, and we'll open it up to questions right now. All right, first one from Katie Mack. She writes, excellent lecture. Would you comment more on networking that Oakes did with Chicano movements, Aztlan, et cetera, in the 1970s?
It's an excellent question. So yeah, no, part of what I was looking at in San Francisco was finding the location for the Brown Berets, which was really difficult to do. A lot of that literature is vanished. I mean, there's more, at least on the Brown Berets in Los Angeles, than what we have in San Francisco itself. But what we would also find is that organizations like the Brown Berets, organizations like the Black Panther Party, were beginning to explore their indigeneity more. And part of this was through these phrasings of the time of organizing, like third world liberation. So this is where you would see new portraits like that of Huey Newton sitting in kind of an African-esque chair with zebra prints on the floor, an African spear in one hand, a shotgun in the other, right? Is this idea of getting in tune with one's indigeneity, one's ancestors, and reconnecting. So Aztlan has these really interesting overtures with this idea of the reclamation of indigenous spaces from a Central American point of view. But people were organizing. One of the more famous families that was really close to Richard Oakes was from Ecuador, and this would be L.D. Bratt. Now, L.D. Bratt is famous because she's the mother of Benjamin Bratt, who's a really key celebrity, formerly married to Julia Roberts, but also has starred in a number of TV shows and movies as well. But they were neighbors to Richard and Annie Oakes in San Francisco. They also became a part of the Alcatraz Occupation, and they would follow Richard all the way up into the occupations of Fort Lawton as well. And so Benjamin Bratt grew up in an incredible time period of activism. But the idea of this being is that one's indigeneity, especially in Central America, where they didn't recognize indigenous citizenship. In other words, they just made everybody citizens, and you didn't have the politic that we had in the North, which was the maintenance of our sovereignty. These became really interesting issues of organizing for indigenous communities south of the border, but it also created these interesting ties in the sense of how do we connect to a larger globalized indigenous movement. And so I'd be more than happy to go more into the literature of that, but I think it's a fabulous question. It's great to hear from Katie. We went to graduate school together, so thank you for a really excellent question, but I'd be happy to go into that even in further detail, but hopefully gives that a little bit of a jumping off point for further research.
Great, thank you. And we'll move to the next question. Oh, this one's actually for me. I just learned that Canada instituted a new national holiday called Orange Shirt Day, which is meant to commemorate the suffering of Indigenous peoples in the 19th and 20th century Indian boarding schools throughout Canada. I was wondering, given kind of the current context around Indigenous calls for resurgence and the kind of reticence about reconciliation, how do you think Richard Oakes would see this gesture on the part of the Canadian government?
I think Richard was more of a brass tacks person. More about show me where, demonstrate, with money, don't demonstrate with words, demonstrate with backing, demonstrate with a change in the laws. Oftentimes these statements are good because they notify the erasure that's come, right? You know, like land acknowledgements. We have a lot of people that critique these land acknowledgements, saying, you know, they're great, but you know, there's no bite without the land back. And I think Richard would be right there with everyone today saying the same thing. You know, that, you know, part of this idea of Native liberation that they were hosting was an idea that we begin to decolonize these spaces. We begin to decolonize these thinkings. And, you know, really the trope of the boarding school is with us in the legacy that we've never desegregated our curriculum, even in the United States. I mean, kids typically go through schools even today in K through 12, not learning anything about Native history. And it's a shame. It's a shame on our country that happens. Just because we desegregated schools and moved kids around didn't mean we actually addressed the curriculum at that time. And in many ways, for us as Native peoples, we still see that as problematic. We're living with boarding school curriculum and boarding school designs to eradicate and erase us in many ways. So I think the big question here is raising awareness, and Orange Shirt Day does that. And I think Richard would, with pride, because of his mother's experience in the boarding schools, would definitely be wearing and blazing orange today had he been with us. And I think that he would also then be leading a further challenge to those ideas of reconciliation in the sense of monetary and land gain. If that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right, next question. This is from Jenna, I assume Panas, or Panas. I hope I didn't mispronounce. She asked, how did you learn about Richard Oakes?
Oh, great question. So, yeah, I was a young student at the University of Missouri in the early 90s. And when I got to the university, I quickly became involved with a Native student organization called From the Four Directions. And, you know, it was kind of more of a social organization. It wasn't really that political. But I came to be aware that at the University of Missouri, they had about 3,000 remains of Native peoples that they kept in physical anthropology department for scientific experimentation and study. And I was incredibly offended by that. I was mortified that our ancestors, our grandparents, you know, were being treated in such a manner. And so I took it upon myself to lead a 4-year campaign to fight and lead a movement at the University of Missouri to have those ancestors turned back over, or repatriated, as it's called, back to their nations for proper reburial and interment to honor their human rights. And in the process of doing so, I also was an enormous geek. I'm just a huge nerd. I would go to the E-stacks of the library, and I would camp out there till 2 or 3 in the morning, and I would just pull books off the shelf one after another, devouring Native history. These were like my great lectures. At least I would take notes on them because I couldn't get enough. And part of this was because it was absent through my K through 12 education, just like most people in America. I remember my high school had like 2 books on Native history, Custer Died for Your Sins, and then another book entitled Cherokee Tragedy. It was all about the Trail of Tears. And so when I got to the university, this is before the days of internet, of course, and Amazon, and like I discovered the E-stacks, and I realized there was far more books available to be able to read on Native history, and I couldn't get enough of it. So I started reading about Red Power and activism, and I really didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, but I wanted to take that trajectory forward. So I wanted to see, you know, what others that had come before and what those other veterans had done to kind of move the story of Indigenous rights forward and learn from them. And I read about Richard Oakes at that point. There was a couple of books. Troy Johnson had a book on the occupation of Alcatraz that came out in '96. And then Robert Warrior and Paul Chet Smith would have Like a Hurricane, which are 2 great books to be able to read on this. But Richard Oakes just is kind of a blip in the figure of these stories. Literally, not much was known about him. He was just kind of, they would always write, he was this charismatic iron worker from New York who wound up in San Francisco. And eventually they would, you know, after he would leave Alcatraz, the story would drop off there. And of course, what they would write about Alcatraz was just contained to the island itself. Nobody ever wrote about Indians of all tribes being involved in occupations in Seattle or being involved in occupations up Pitt River. And then, of course, his death was a mystery. In 1972, there was 5 or 6 different things I would read that would have different conclusions about how he died. And I was just always left with a mystery. And I took a biography class when I was in graduate school at the University of New Mexico, go Lobos. And at New Mexico, there was a biography course taught by the late, great Frank Saz. And he went around the room and he said, I want you to choose a person that you want to write about for the semester. You just always want to know more about. And for me, it was automatically Richard Oakes. And that started an 18-year journey, which took me between two coasts, to Brooklyn, to San Francisco, Seattle, into Canada. It took me into veterans' homes of the movement. It took me into multiple archives across the country. And I'm still learning. I'm still learning about the story as I go. But it's been an incredible journey. And my hope is to bring justice to Richard finally into this story. So great question.
Thank you. I think we have time for two more questions. So we'll go with Derek Nault. He asks, can you go in more depth about indigenization, and how that process interacted with coalition politics?
Perfect question. So, part of this was just to speak to the coalition politics of this, first and foremost. I would get, as a 60s scholar to some degree, I would really get interested in trying to pull up books on the Black Panther Party. I would pull up books on the Black Panther Party. I would go to the index and I would try to find any, connection to Indians of all tribes, or I try to find any connection to Native politics. And typically in most of the histories that have been written about the Black Panther Party, nothing appears, even though they're in Oakland, right? And in Oakland, they have the Oakland Indian Friendship House, which isn't too far away from where the Black Panthers basically get their base. And what's interesting is the Oakland Indian Friendship House starts up a breakfast program in the 1950s, which eventually Black Panther Party will also start up a breakfast program later on as a part of the right? So some of this is about modeling. Some of this is about mirroring in tactics, right? The other side of it is that when you read about Native history, more particularly Red Power, a lot of people that have written about it earlier would say, well, Native politics is just based upon the civil rights movement. We're just essentially remanufacturing the tactics of civil rights, and we're not doing anything new. And that couldn't be further from the truth, because primarily on the front lines of this is the sovereignty of our nations that we're fighting for. We have a different kind of politic as Native peoples in this country. In other words, we're not necessarily looking for integration per se. We're looking to own that counter. We're looking for that land to come back. So there's a different kind of form of politic when we begin to kind of take apart Red Power. And Red Power at its core is even more fascinating in urban environments, is what I began to discover. Because what's happening is there is that coalition politic that's automatically a part of the community center. I mean, we have people that are from the Southwest, who are Dene, who are Apache, who are in conversation with Cherokees from the greater Southeast, or in conversation with Lenapes and others from at least the Northeast, and Mohawks. And then we have people coming in from at least Seattle who are Haida or Makah, who are also in these conversations. And despite us coming from over 500 different cultures and languages, we begin to get together. We begin to find ways in which we can communicate, and we can identify and not become detribalized in this communication. But we can amplify our nationalism. We can amplify that Native nationalism in the streets. And we can go for a larger collective right, or Indigenous right at that point. And in going for that larger collective Indigenous right, a part of that indigenization process was, how do we transform those institutions into Native-led institutions? How do we transform how people see us even? I mean, we can see this with Richard Oakes' actions. There was that one photograph I showed you where he's got his arms wrapped around Annie, his wife, which was an incredible, important photograph. I mean, in the sense of showcasing and in talking back against the stereotypes of Native masculinity that was to showcase us as the savage warrior. He's showcasing love at a time when this nation needed love. He was showcasing his role as a Native father, not just somebody who was a militant leader of a takeover, right? And that militant label is even more fascinating when we break that down, right? Which was really a media trope in order to authenticate this movement, if you will, to the far left at this time. And it was a misnomer because it was a completely nonviolent movement on the West Coast at this time. Beyond that, indigenization was about the taking of these spaces, liberating them for Native peoples, and making a presence, if you will, that can be recognized and, of course, expanded upon. In other words, even to this day, that expansion takes place in the form of the Ilani, reclaiming their tribal lands, and the coastal Miwok reclaiming their tribal lands throughout the greater San Francisco area, which are their homelands. And it's an ongoing process. But yeah, it's a bigger question than what I could, really give it time for tonight. But I appreciate the question, and I think it is a question that hopefully, might influence your own research one day as well, because we need more people doing that kind of research.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, we only have time for one more question. We did have several good questions in the comments that we're just not going to be able to get to, but I wanted to thank everyone for their for putting those questions in the comments. So we will end from a question from GOC. They ask, thank you so much for this presentation. What can or should a non-native do to support natives and help in their activism?
It's a wonderful question. We need more allies. We need more people that are standing up and saying, we need more Native historians. We need more Native literature. We need more ethnic studies at our campus. We need more Native educators. And beyond that, leading the revolution in the sense of the classroom, becoming teachers, but in all aspects, advocating for Indigenous peoples, devouring Native literature, becoming the geeks and nerds that sit in the E-stacks and begin to understand that greater politic of Indian country, and that there's really three forms of law in this country. There's federal, tribal, and state law. And oftentimes, most Americans are completely oblivious that there is such a thing as tribal law in this country, let alone that we as Native people still exist. So that very recognition is incredibly important. Beyond that is to visit the sites too. I want to ask everyone to, when they're in San Francisco, I always say, go to Alcatraz Island, take the experience. I mean, I didn't myself get it. And I think this is an important point. It speaks to memorials and commemoration, the whole title of the series. My first trip to Alcatraz was eye-opening. I remember I'd done all the readings in my master's for it. I finally got the chance to raise money and get out to San Francisco, go see the island. And I'd seen all the photographs of the political statements and stuff, but I just didn't get it till I went there. And the power of history is being able to go there, right? The power of history is in the emotion of the story. And there's power in that because it has the potential to create change. So when I was going to Alcatraz, I get down to the docks, I get on the ferry boat, I'm riding in the ferry boat, and I'm all excited, right? Because you can hear the sea lions squawking in the background. You can see the superstructure of the Golden Gate Bridge, on the left, and I'm geeking out, right? There's other people that are like, oh, I can't wait to see Al Capone's cell. I can't wait to see Machine Gun Kelly. And you can kind of hear him. Oh, Alcatraz. Yeah, The Rock was filmed here. Wonder where Nicolas Cage walked. You can hear these kind of conversations floating, and I'm laughing myself. Because, while a lot of people are going there to see America's toughest criminals, I'm going there to see America's toughest Indians. And I go to the front of the boat, right? Because I want to be like, hey, what was it like? Or what did it look like when Richard jumped off the front of that boat? And what did it look like to maybe swim that 250? What did he face, right? Because people weren't supposed to do that. There's a reason there's a federal prison put on an island in San Francisco. You're not supposed to swim to it nor from it, right? It's incredible that he was even able to make this one. So I'm geeking out. The boat starts to pull around the island, and there's a dock. The dock, is on the other side of the island, facing away from at least Fisherman's Wharf. As we start to pull up to that dock, there's the sign. It says Indians welcome, and it hit me because I couldn't look away. That was the only thing that you could see, and I was going towards it, and it was pulling me in as it was pulling the boat in, as the tide was coming into the dock, and goosebumps kind of went down my spine. And I realized, as an Indigenous person, this is the first ever welcome sign I've ever seen in my own home country. And it did something to me. It infected me because I realized what they did at that point was changing me. It was making me feel pride once again in who I am. It was making me feel pride in this movement. It was making me see this movement as a success. It was making me witness the testimony that these students brought that day in 1969. That this place is beyond just a memorial. I mean, this is a place for us that was like our I Have a Dream speech. This is our Lincoln Memorial. And to this day, with the numbers of people that go to that island, Richard and a lot of the students that led this movement, like Lenata Means, they did something that outlived them and will outlive their generation. They opened doors for my own generation. Doors that were closed to them are now open for us. And so it is one of those great stories in American history that it oftentimes has gone untold. And my hope is to reframe it. My hope is that we begin to also see and discover many more stories in 20th century Native history. So my hope is that, if anything, I want to encourage you to jump in and take more Indigenous history, if not specialize in it. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I do also want to say that we have had a lot of comments from Indigenous peoples from various ethnicities and tribal nations discussing how inspiring your talk has been, Kent. So I really want to thank you for that. And I do want to say I absolutely agree. The more relationships and connections we can make, the stronger we are. So thank you again. And I think that we can wrap up now. I want to again thank Dr. Ken Blansett, Dr. Evelyn Stern for putting this all together, and Dr. Blansett for speaking. And with that, I will say good night to everyone. I hope you all have a good night, and thanks again for tuning in.